We recently saw a game on this channel where Tani Adewumi took on Alireza Firouzja in a Title Tuesday game, and Tani played very, very tough. In fact, he was clearly better until the very end, where he did make a blunder and lose the game. Of course, Firouzja is top 10 in the world. This is another game he played in that same tournament on Title Tuesday against another Grandmaster, Grandmaster Melikset Kachian. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He's actually one of the top FIDE trainers in the world. Even Levon Aronian, the Super Grandmaster, credits him with pushing him past and getting the Grandmaster title. So a very tough opponent, and Grandmaster Kachian has the white pieces. Tani Adewumi has black. The ratings you see on the screen are their chess.com ratings. As this is Title Tuesday, it's 3 minutes for each side with a 1 second increment. Let us begin. Grandmaster Kachian plays e4, c5, knight f3, and e6. Now, Tani has an idea in mind. He wants to play the Sveshnikov. Usually you play knight to c6 to get into the Sveshnikov. The problem is bishop to b5, the Rossolimo. Now, this is certainly playable for black, but not every player with the black pieces wants to play into this. So he plays e6, which is another way that you can get into the Sveshnikov, depending on what white does. d4, cd4, knight d4, knight to c6, knight c3, and knight to f6. This is called the four knights Sicilian. And if white plays knight to c6, you would stay in the four knights territory. But knight d to b5 creates the opportunity for black to go into a Sveshnikov. If he plays bishop b4, you're still in four knights territory. But after d6, almost every game from this position transposes into a Sveshnikov Sicilian. Bishop to f4 is the first move to create that transposition, attacking d6 three times, the knight, the bishop, and the queen. And then after e5, kicking the bishop and defending d6, bishop to g5. And we have transposed into a Sveshnikov Sicilian. This is a great opening. The only reason you don't see it more often is because there are so many ways for white to avoid it. But it is one of the very best openings that black can play. He begins by playing a6, kicking this knight on b5 to a passive square, the only square it can move to, which is a3. Not a great square for this knight. It'll have to emerge somewhere else on the board. Then b5 with the threat of b4, forking the two knights. Here white plays bishop takes knight, gf6. So what we have here is what's called a Boleslavsky structure. You see the same type of structure, particularly with this weakness at d5, in Najdorf Sicilians and a few other lines. But here in the Sveshnikov, it is very, very dynamic. The reason is you see these really ugly pawns at f7 and f6. They're doubled and they're fixed for the moment. However, what black wants to do is use these pawns as levers to attack white's center, and he has two of them that he can do it with, and that creates a very dynamic position. So black's position is a little fragile in terms of its structure, but lots of dynamic potential. Knight to d5, the standard move, taking advantage of the weak square. f5, playing that first pawn lever. And now white plays c3, keeping the knight out of d4. It's fair to ask, what happens if black just takes on e4? That seems like a pretty good move. The problem is white can play this powerful move, bishop to b5. And after a takes, bishop, knight takes, he's threatening knight to c7, check, which would fork the king and the rook. If the rook moves to a7, then after knight takes, queen to a4, check, and you pick up that knight. Even cooler is if they play rook to b8 to save it, then knight b to c7, check. That forces, if he doesn't want to give up the queen, forces the king to d7, and then boom, queen to g4, check, and then checkmate. So that is why you can't just take that pawn on e4, so c3 is the better move. Bishop to g7. Now in that same variation, this king can move to f8. So pawn takes e4 is now a threat. So white takes first, bishop takes f5, knight to c2. This knight can go to b4 or to e3 to support the knight on d5. Tani goes ahead and castles, and now knight c to e3. Hitting the bishop at f5 with tempo. And black has so many weak light squares, he really doesn't want to give up that bishop, certainly not for a knight. And also he supports his knight at d5, bishop to e6, now bishop to d3 and f5. And we can see Tani has three pawn islands, this a6, b5 pawn island, this central pawn island and this isolated pawn on h7. And this pawn structure is kind of weak, but it also can become incredibly powerful, particularly if these e and f pawns begin to roll. White has to be careful. Castles, e4 from Tani. Now, he doesn't move his bishop yet. First, he plays knight to f4, hitting Tani's bishop on e6. If he takes that bishop, he would also fork the rook and the queen, so the bishop has to retreat. First, bishop to f7, and now bishop to c2. Tani plays queen to g5. Obviously, he's hitting that knight on f4, also putting some pressure on White's king side. And here, Grandmaster Kacyan plays g3. Believe it or not, in my database, this is actually a novelty, but it is a very thematic move in this position, very standard. It's just the move order itself hadn't been played before. Rook a to d8. And here the best move is probably bishop to b3. There are some weak light squares in Black's position, particularly d5 is still a weak square, just as it was earlier on in the position. So by offering to exchange off those light squared bishops, White gets some play in the center. But instead, he played the move f3, trying to nibble at this central pawn formation and decrease its power. But then d5 from Tani, and now this is a bit better for Black. Here, bishop to b3 was played by Kacyan, but it's not the same as it was in the previous move. Computers recommend this move, knight e to d5, which puts the knight in a pin. Human beings don't play like that and shouldn't play like that. Computers can do this and defend. People cannot, so he did not play that move. But this is not the same situation because the next move Tani plays, a very powerful idea, d4. The pawns begin to roll. And this rook is opposite the queen. The pawn threatens the knight. Black has a lot of dynamism in his position. Bishop f7 check was played in the game. Rook takes f7. And here, really, knight e to d5, an incredibly hard move to find. It really, at any time control, was White's best hope of surviving this position. But he plays cd4. It looks like an innocent enough move. But after bishop takes d4 from Tani, Black's position becomes incredibly, feverishly active. As you can see, he has a pin on that knight on e3, and that pin is going to tie White up in knots as the game progresses. First, queen to c1. Defends the knight, and it does gain some counterplay against the knight at c6 also, but that knight moves to e5, threatening to come in at f3 with check. Later, it might even go to d3. So here, instead of allowing the knight to land on f3, he takes the pawn that would support the knight. But now, since he's taken that pawn, the g4 square is available. And the knight moves to g4, piling on the knight. Two pieces attack the knight, only one defends it. So Grandmaster Kacyan has to use a second piece, the rook, to defend the knight. Now fe4, and the threat is to just take this knight. Give up the exchange, the pawn takes, queen takes, and White would just be completely busted. He would be a threat of mates coming in on h2, the knight will be attacked 3 times, the game would be over. White has to prevent that from happening. So he takes that knight at f4 and moves it back to g2. So now we see all these pieces dedicated to the defense of this one knight, which is still pinned on e3. Move queen h6 is a strong idea that computers recommend, with the threat of mate on h2. Tani plays another strong move, rook to f3. We can see he's got 4 pieces, the queen, the knight, the rook, and the bishop, attacking the pinned knight, and White only has 3 pieces defending it. White's position is about to collapse. He plays king to h1, stepping out of the pin, and Tani could just take the material. That would be a perfectly legitimate move. But instead, he plays knight to f2 check, king to g1, and then he goes back, creating the same position. He could play knight to d3 forking, but that would be, he can get a lot more out of the position than that. So he goes back to g4, the king goes back to h1, and now he takes on e3, and that is a piece. And unless White can generate some counterplay against Black's somewhat open king at g8, he's going to be finished. So queen to c7. If he takes the bishop, then Black just exchanges, and he's up an entire rook in the endgame. So that just wouldn't work at all. So queen to c7, hoping to generate some counterplay against the king. Knight to f2 check, king to g1, knight to d3, discovered check, and also attacking the rook at e1. So rook takes e3 is pretty much forced. Rook takes e3. And now if knight e3, queen takes e3 check, after the king moves, rook to f8, and mate is coming very, very quickly. So instead of allowing that, Grandmaster Kacyan plays the move rook to f1, threatening a potential check on f7. It still wouldn't be enough, I don't think, just to look at it. But he definitely doesn't want black to play his own rook to f8. But instead, Tani plays rook to f3, neutralizing that rook. After rook takes, pawn takes, knight to f4, Tani played queen to c5 check, which threatens or hits with check and offers the exchange of queens, forces the exchange of queens. And in this position, Grandmaster Kacyan actually ran out of time, but the position is obviously totally winning for black, who was up an entire rook in the endgame. So congratulations to Tani Adewumi on this very nice win against a strong Grandmaster. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.